She heard them laughing from the hallway. That was the part that would stay with her longest, not the words themselves, which were awful enough, but the laughter. Her father's deep, rolling satisfaction. Her elder sister's bright, relieved giggle. Even her mother, who had always maintained a careful, performative tenderness toward her most troublesome child, letting loose a sound Nora had never heard from her before. Something loose and unguarded. The sound of a woman finally setting down a burden she had carried too long. "Caleb Hurst," her father was saying, his voice carrying easily through the parlor door. I still can't believe the man agreed. Reclusive as a badger up on that mountain, hasn't shown his face in Millhaven in 3 years, and then he rides in asking specifically for Nora. Specifically. A pause, and she could hear the clink of his glass. I didn't ask questions. "You should have charged him more," her sister said. "I charged him what the market would bear for a girl who argues with ministers and knocked over Judge Patterson's supper at the Founders' Day table." More laughter. Frankly, I'm amazed he offered anything. The man must not know what he's getting. "He'll find out," her mother said, and there was something in her voice that was almost fond, the fondness of a woman relieved of a problem, surveying the clean space where it used to be. "She'll have opinions about his ranch hands and where he hangs his hats and what the chickens are being fed. She'll drive him to drink inside a month. His problem now," her father said simply, and that was the thing that settled into Nora's chest like a coal, burning slow and steady. His problem now. 3 days later, she was packed into a hired wagon with her 2 traveling trunks, her father's handshake, and her mother's dry kiss on her cheek, heading north toward the San Miguel Range and a man she had never met. She had been given very little information about Caleb Hurst. He was 34, 8 years her senior. He had inherited his father's cattle operation 11 years ago, expanded it to something significant enough that her father, who had never been particularly interested in mountain ranching, called it considerable. He did not come to town. He sent men when he needed supplies, sent letters when he needed contracts, and sent a lawyer when he needed anything that required a signature. The lawyer had conducted the entire arrangement without Hurst himself appearing once, which her father had apparently found efficient, and which Nora found either deeply ominous or deeply strange, and she had not yet decided which. The San Miguels rose slowly as the wagon climbed, the pines thickening and the air cooling until she could no longer smell the dust of the flatlands at all, only resin and cold water, and something she had no name for, the particular clean quality of air that had not been breathed many times over. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded and watched the mountains come toward her, and she did not cry, because she had decided in the hallway outside her father's parlor that she was not going to give this situation the satisfaction of her tears. What she had not decided was what she was going to do when she arrived. The ranch revealed itself in pieces. First the fence line, new posts, good wood, set at careful intervals in the rocky ground. Then the outbuildings, a barn so large it blocked a portion of the sky, a long, low building that might have been a bunkhouse. Then the main house, and she had expected a cabin, the rough dwelling of a reclusive man, but what she saw was something else. 2 stories, stone on the ground floor and timber above, a covered porch running its full length, windows cut wide and generous on every side. It looked like a house someone had thought about, a house someone had wanted to be habitable. The wagon stopped in the yard. A boy of perhaps 14 appeared and wordlessly took the horses' heads. The driver climbed down and set her trunks in the dirt without ceremony. And then the front door of the house opened, and Caleb Hurst walked out. She catalogued him the way she catalogued everything, quickly and without sentiment. Tall, wide through the shoulders, the build of a man who worked rather than merely directed work. Dark hair going gray at the temples despite the relative youth of his face. He moved without hurry, down the porch steps and across the yard, and he was looking at her in a way she found immediately unsettling. Not assessing, not the way men usually looked at her, calculating and faintly irritated. Just looking, as though confirming something he already knew. He stopped a few feet from her and removed his hat. "Miss Aldridge," he said. "I'm Caleb Hurst. I imagine the ride was long." "It was," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "I need to tell you something before we go inside. I should have told it to your family before any of this was arranged, but I didn't. And that was a failure on my part that I intend to correct with you directly." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. "I know who you are, not from your father's description. From before. 3 years ago in Millhaven, outside Greer's Dry Goods. You saw that old man Pepper being pushed and called a thief when he hadn't stolen anything. You stepped in. Everyone else just watched. She stared at him. The memory surfaced sharp and immediate. The old man's thin wrists, the merchant's red face, the crowd that stood and stared and looked away. She had not stepped in because she was brave. She had stepped in because she was, as her family often noted, congenitally incapable of walking past something wrong. I was in town that one day for a legal matter, Hurst said. I saw you from across the street. And I thought, he stopped. Started again. I'm not explaining this well. The arrangement your father made, I want you to know I could have done it differently, more honestly. I should have written you directly and told you what I'm telling you now and asked if there was any interest. I didn't do that, and I'm sorry for it. He looked at her steadily. What I can offer you instead is this. Stay 1 month. Work the ranch, see what it is, see what I am. If at the end of that month you want to leave, I will give you a horse, a good one, yours to keep, and enough money to go wherever you choose and start something for yourself. No argument, no recrimination. You walk away. Nora was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines at the ridge above them. The boy was still holding the horses with patient, professional stillness. And the bride price? She asked. What my father was paid. Something shifted in his face. I didn't pay it, he said. The lawyer offered a settlement instead. Land rights in the South Valley your father wanted for grazing access. It's what your father took, not money for you. I won't pay money for a person. I want you to know that. She looked at him a long time. She had prepared herself for many things on the wagon ride up. Contempt, dismissal, the particular exhaustion of a man who had acquired a wife the way he might acquire furniture. She had not prepared herself for this. A man standing in a dirt yard taking off his hat and telling her the truth about himself, including the parts that didn't show him well. 1 month, she said. 1 month, he confirmed. And you're a guest, not a servant. I'll introduce you to the household and the men, and you can do as much or as little as you choose. I don't do well with little, she said. I know, he said, and she had the strange sensation that he meant it in a way her family had never meant anything similar, that he knew it and considered it neither problem nor failing, just simple fact. He held out his hand toward the porch, and she walked ahead of him into her temporary house and tried very hard not to find that strange gesture. The truth-telling, the open door, the offer of an exit, comforting, because she had learned a long time ago that comfort extended quickly, was often comfort that cost you something in the end. The ranch was not what she had expected, and she arrived at this conclusion within the first week by the straightforward method of being present for all of it. She had been given a room on the second floor with a window that faced the eastern ridge and turned amber at dawn, and she used the early light each day before anyone else was moving to take the measure of things. The operation was larger than she'd grasped from the yard, several hundred head of cattle in the upper and lower pastures, a horse breeding program that was apparently respected enough that buyers came from as far as the Dakotas, a small but productive kitchen garden that was badly managed and slowly dying, and 6 ranch hands of varying ages and competencies who regarded her arrival with undisguised wariness. She did not push. She watched. She helped where she could make herself genuinely useful rather than performatively busy, and she was careful to distinguish between the two, which was something her family had never taught her, but which she had learned by watching people who actually accomplished things versus people who merely generated activity around themselves. She fixed the kitchen garden on the 4th day, not by announcing intentions, but by arriving before breakfast with a trowel and working until she understood what was wrong, which turned out to be drainage and companion planting and the placement of certain herbs that were being slowly poisoned by their neighbors. Hurst's housekeeper, a compact and originally suspicious woman named Clara, who had managed the house for 8 years and viewed the arrival of any new female presence with professional skepticism, watched her from the kitchen window for most of the morning before appearing in the garden with coffee and sitting on the low wall without speaking. Nora drank the coffee. Clara didn't leave. They sat together in the cool morning without words until Clara said abruptly, "The basil's been wrong for 2 years. I couldn't sort out why." "Mint too close," Nora said. "Mint takes everything." Clara looked at the garden and nodded once, and that was the beginning of something, though neither of them named it. Hurst himself was harder to read, which she found interesting rather than frustrating because she was used to men being easy to read, her father's irritation, the minister's condescension, the town's various eligible bachelors in their transparent calculations, and a man who was genuinely difficult to read was, in its way, a novelty. He worked hard and visibly, which she had not expected of a man who ran something of his size. She had assumed owners supervised and workers labored, but Hurst was in the saddle before his men some mornings, and she saw him more than once come in at evening with his hands torn up from fencing work. He did not perform labor for her observation. She simply noticed it. He was quiet at meals and precise in speech when he did speak, and he asked her questions, real ones, not the polite surface questions people asked women, about the garden, about a supply ledger she had noticed and mentioned an inefficiency in, about whether she had ridden much before coming up the mountain. When she told him she had, he offered her the use of any horse in the barn and said only, "Take Mira if you want something with opinions," and left the choice to her. She took Mira, a steel-gray mare who did indeed have opinions, and whose opinions turned out to align reasonably well with her own, and began to ride the property in the afternoons, learning it the way she liked to learn things, by direct acquaintance rather than description. On the 11th day, she was riding the south fence when she came upon one of the hands, a young man named Ellis, struggling alone with a downed section of line while a steer leaned its full, contemptuous weight against the remaining posts. She tied Mira to a tree, grabbed the fence wire from the ground without being asked, and held it taut while Ellis worked the stretcher and reset the posts, neither of them speaking more than necessary for the work. When it was done, Ellis looked at her with an expression she had seen only a few times in her life, the expression of someone who had expected less and received more and was genuinely recalibrating. "That was good help," he said, somewhat in spite of himself. "The steer has terrible judgment," she said, and Ellis laughed, and something shifted in the collective temperature of the ranch toward her. She did not mark the end of the first month. The month passed and she was still there, and neither of them mentioned it, and she understood eventually that the offer had simply transformed into an ongoing condition. She could still leave whenever she chose, and he would still provide the means, and both of them knew it, and neither of them required it. Said aloud again. What she felt about this, about the fact that she was not leaving, she kept careful and private and did not examine too closely, the way you don't press on a bruise you're not sure the depth of. She felt useful here. She felt like herself here in a way she had not felt in her father's house for years, perhaps ever. She did not yet know what to do with the man who had made that possible. She found out more about him in pieces, the way you learn any real thing, not from a single revelation but from accumulated small facts that eventually add up to a picture. She learned that he had taught himself to read Spanish from a dictionary and a Bible because the previous owner of the South Range had left behind ledgers in that language, and he hadn't wanted to pay someone to translate them. She learned that the bunkhouse had a bookshelf, a real one, with real books, his doing, because he believed, in a matter-of-fact way that admitted no sentimentality about it, that men who read were better at their work. She learned that he had given half a year's profit to the family of a hand who had died in a riding accident 4 years prior. Not as charity, but as what he called obligation, and that the family still sent him Christmas letters. She did not learn these things from him directly. He did not speak about himself in that way. She learned them from Clara, from Ellis, from the shape of the operation itself, which bore the marks of every choice its owner had made and was therefore, she came to understand, a kind of extended self-portrait. There was one evening in the 7th week when they were both on the porch after supper, she with a mending basket, and he with a letter he was composing in laborious longhand, and the light was doing something extraordinary with the peaks above them, going from orange to a deep arterial red that bled slowly into purple, and she set her mending down and watched it without meaning to make a moment of it, and when she glanced at him, he was watching her watch the mountains, and he looked away immediately with the swift, precise movement of a man caught doing something he had told himself not to do. She looked back at the mountains. Her heart did something she had not given it permission to do, and she ignored it with the dogged focus of long practice. He did not touch her. He was respectful in a way that went beyond politeness into something more considered. He was careful in the way that a man is careful when he is aware of what his size and position represent to someone else, and she recognized this awareness and felt it, oddly, as a form of tenderness. But he was present. He noticed when she was tired and said nothing, only ensured that supper was early. He noticed when the mare had favored her left foreleg all morning and had the horse examined before Nora had thought to mention it. Small things, precise things, the attentiveness of someone paying genuine attention without making it a performance. Her father arrived on a Tuesday in the 9th week. He rode in with 2 men behind him, and his hat pushed back in the way that meant he was feeling authoritative, and he swept the yard with an assessing eye before it settled on her on the porch, and he did something with his face that was almost paternal warmth and was actually, she knew, the warm-up to leverage. "Nora," he said, climbing down. "You look well." He looked around again. "I had business near Millhaven and thought I'd stop." "You thought wrong," she said pleasantly, coming down the steps. Her father's face did the thing faces do when pleasantness turns out to have edges. He lowered his voice. "I've heard the bride payment wasn't made as agreed." That Hurst changed the terms of the arrangement. "There are legal implications there, and I want to speak with him directly about—" "He didn't change the terms," Nora said. "He refused to pay a price for me as a person and offered you something you judged more valuable, which you accepted. You took the land access in the South Valley. There was no breach." Her father looked at her the way he always looked at her when she didn't cooperate, with a particular, long-suffering patience that was also contempt held in suspension. The arrangement was for a marriage, and if that marriage hasn't been properly concluded— "It's been properly concluded," she said, which was almost true and would, she had already decided, become entirely true. "I am here. I am well. Your business interest in my life ended when you shook his lawyer's hand, and I think you know that." She looked at him levelly, the way she had always been told not to look at her father, directly, without apology, and she held it. "I think what you actually came to see was whether I was miserable enough to be leveraged with. I'm not. I'm sorry to disappoint you." He left within the hour. Hurst had not appeared during any of it, which she had not understood at the time. That evening, she found him in the barn working quietly at something, and she stood in the doorway and said, "You saw him arrive." "I did," Hurst said. "You stayed away on purpose." "It was your matter to handle," he said simply, and looked up at her. "Was it handled?" "Yes," she said. He nodded and went back to his work, and she stood there a moment longer than necessary, and then she went back to the house. She lay awake that night for a long time in the amber at dawn room, looking at the dark ceiling, thinking about what it meant to be trusted with something that was yours. Simply and without ceremony handed back to you the authority over your own situation. No rescue, no intervention, no man stepping between her and her difficulty. Just faith that she could handle what was hers to handle. 2 weeks later, her father had Hurst arrested. She heard it from Ellis, who rode hard to the house at mid-morning with his hat in his hand and a look of genuine distress that told her it was serious before he opened his mouth. The charge was fraudulent. Theft of land access rights. A creative reframing of the South Valley arrangement that required a corrupt magistrate and her father's money, and the testimony of someone willing to lie, all of which her father had apparently assembled with commendable efficiency. They had taken Hurst down to Millhaven 2 days prior, Ellis said. He was being held at the county jail. Nora was saddled before Ellis finished talking. She did not tell Clara where she was going, though Clara watched her from the porch with the expression of someone who had already guessed. She did not take the established trail, because the established trail was slow and went by way of the East Road, and she did not have time for the East Road. She took the ridge route that Mira had shown her on those first exploratory rides, steep and demanding and cutting 3 hours off the descent, and she came into Millhaven at mid-afternoon with her hair coming down, and the mare in a proper lather, and her mind already working through what she knew. She knew the arrangement. She had seen the lawyer's correspondence because Hurst kept his papers organized and visible and had never hidden them from her, which she had taken as informational and now understood was also trust. She knew the terms of the land access agreement, and she knew the name of the lawyer who had drafted it, and she knew, because she had grown up in this town and spent years watching its mechanics, which 2 men on the magistrate's bench were honest, and which were not. She went to the honest ones first. It took the rest of the afternoon and the testimony of the lawyer, whom she found in his office and presented with what she knew with a precision that left him very little room for equivocation, and a letter that the minister confirmed she had the right to submit as an interested party in a property matter, and finally a conversation in the magistrate's office that required her to be louder and clearer and more immovable than she had been in any room in her life. She was all of these things. She was also right, which helped considerably. They released Hurst at dusk. He came out of the jail into the blue evening light and saw her standing in the street with Mira beside her, and he stopped on the steps for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back. He came down the steps and crossed to her, and he said, Ellis told you. He did. He stood there, and he had the look of a man sorting through several possible responses, and what he finally said was, "You rode the ridge route. The east road is too slow. The ridge route is—" He stopped. "You could have been thrown." "Mira doesn't throw people," she said. "She has opinions, but she's sound." He looked at the mare and then at her, and something happened in his face that she had no precise word for. An opening, a lowering of something carefully held, like a man finally putting down what he's been carrying long enough that the absence of the weight changes his whole posture. He reached out and touched her face with the back of 2 fingers, briefly, the most careful touch she had ever received, and then he dropped his hand and said quietly, "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," she said. "This is mine to handle, too." They were married 2 weeks later on the porch of the house, in the early morning when the eastern ridge was amber. Clara wore her best dress. Ellis and the hands cleaned up properly and stood in the yard below the steps. The minister from Millhaven, the honest one, conducted a ceremony that was brief and exact and contained nothing ornamental, which suited both of them. When it was done and the minister had shaken hands and Clara had produced a cake that was better than the occasion strictly required, Nora stood at the porch railing and looked out at the mountains and felt, with a clarity she had not often experienced, that she was standing in the right place. Hurst came to stand beside her, close enough that their arms touched. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, without looking at her, "I told you, when you arrived, that I'd seen you in Millhaven 3 years ago. I want to tell you the rest of it. I'd been in town for a legal matter, and I was heading back, and I saw you with that old man, and I thought I'd never seen anyone do something like that with so little apparent calculation. Like it was simply what you did when something was wrong in front of you." He paused. "I thought about it for a long time. I thought a person like that—" He stopped again. "A person like that what?" she asked. He looked at her then. "A person like that would know what this place is supposed to be," he said, "and would make it that. I just didn't know how to find you without—" He gestured somewhat helplessly, which was the first helpless gesture she had seen from him, and which she found absurdly endearing, without the entire mess of it. "The mess of it," she said. "I'm sorry for the mess of it." She considered him, this man who had waited 3 years and built something worth waiting for and then gone about acquiring her company in arguably the worst possible way out of some combination of reticence and limited social infrastructure, and then spent the subsequent months being scrupulously honest about all of it. "You could have just written me a letter," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "That would have been considerably less complicated." "Yes." She leaned her shoulder against his arm and looked back at the mountains. Below them in the yard, Ellis was attempting to teach one of the younger hands a card game with indifferent success. Clara was talking to the minister with the focused intensity she brought to every conversation. The mare was in the paddock doing nothing in particular, with the magnificent self-possession of a horse who knew her own worth. "I'm not easy to live with," Nora said. "I should tell you that, though I suspect you know." "I know," he said. And it was the same word he'd used when she arrived, carrying the same weight. Not resignation, not tolerance, but something that looked, now that she knew him well enough to see it, remarkably like relief. Like a man finally in the presence of the weather he'd been waiting for after a long, still drought. "I have opinions about how the south pasture's being grazed," she said. "I know that too. And the accounts could be organized better, and Clara deserves a raise, and the hands need a day off that is actually a day off and not just less work than usual." "You can speak to all of it," he said. She turned her head and looked at him directly, and he looked back, and there was no discomfort in it on either side, no calculation, no performance, just 2 people who had found, by a route considerably more circuitous than necessary, something that fit. She thought of her mother's laugh in the parlor, of his problem now, of the wagon ride up through the thickening pines. She thought of the ridge route, and the amber light, and an old man's wrists, and a crowd that had stood and done nothing while she stepped forward because she was, as her family had always said, difficult. She had not known then that difficult was just another word for unwilling to let wrong things stand. She knew it now. "Good," she said, and turned back to the mountains, and they stood together in the morning light while below them the ranch went about its work, and for the first time in her life, Nora Aldridge, Nora Hurst, felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of a woman who has finally arrived at the place she was always supposed to be. Share.